Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube. And if you've not already done so, please silence your phones. Join us upstairs at 11 a.m. tomorrow, Thursday, September 15th, in the Green Book Traveling Exhibit for a gallery talk with Dr. Angela Stewart from the Margaret Walker Center at Jackson State University. She will discuss the bygone businesses of Farish Street. Then tomorrow evening at 6, come back for our Women in Country Music, Songs, and Conversations program, which will be held in conjunction with the World of Marty Stewart exhibit. The free program will feature performances by Mississippi country music artists. It should be really fun. You remember that these museums are free, as well as the special exhibits, on Sundays, and they'll be free on Saturday, September 17th as well, thanks to the Smithsonian Magazine and the Smithsonian Affiliates program. Finally, I hope that you'll join us next week for History is Lunch, when Aram Goodsouzian and Vijay Shah will talk about the new graphic novel they've collaborated on titled Man on a Mission, James Meredith and the Battle of Ole Miss. Today, we're delighted to welcome back our friend, Dr. Douglas Richardson, to present Yellow Man Vincent and the 1835 Slave Insurrection Scare. Douglas Richardson graduated from the University of Mississippi School of Medicine and received postgraduate education from Johns Hopkins Hospital, Vanderbilt University Medical Center, St. Mary's Hospital in London, and Karolinska Hospital in Stockholm. His appointments include attending pathologist, Vanderbilt University Medical Center, pathologist in chief and director of laboratories, Research Medical Center, Kansas City, and chief of pathology and medical director of laboratories at River Oaks Hospital in Flowood. Since retiring, Richardson has undertaken research and writing projects on various aspects of Mississippi, including the 1875 Clinton Massacre, on which topic he gave a terrific History is Lunch in 2014. I know many of you were there for that. I'm looking forward to what he has to say today. Help me welcome Douglas Richardson.
Thank you, Chris. It's nice to be back with you again after 8 years. I'm a little slower on the draw than last time. As Benjamin Franklin said, "Oh, to be 70 again." Okay. So off we go. As many of you know, I'm from Clinton. I grew up there, went to Clinton High School, went to Mississippi College, and was a resident of the town from 1947 to 1965, or 69 approximately. I got interested in the history of Clinton mainly because there were these historical markers scattered about, and when I started looking at them and asking questions myself, it led me down a pathway that I thought was extremely interesting and fascinating. So after retirement from my medical practice, I sort of used the Department of Archives and History as my second home some days, and I want to thank them for all the resources they've provided me and allowed me access to. Let me give a plug here for two excellent resources on this topic. One is Joshua Rothman's Flush Times and Fever Dreams. It's an absolutely wonderful book, extremely well researched and very well written. It's a very comfortable read. And I'd like to give Ben Wynn's book on Henry Stewart Foote a plug. This is the best biography you can find on Henry Stewart Foote, who will play a role in our presentation today. Let me give you the caveat and the warning that when I discuss topics dating back to the early 19th century, I use what I call proxy or placeholder images. Remember that unless you were living at the time around 1840, there's not going to be a photograph. There may be a painting, but no photographs, because daguerreotypes didn't make their way to this country until about 1839. So in order to keep up with the complex events, sometimes I use these placeholder photographs. For example, if I was discussing the series of events involving the death of Alexander Hamilton after the duel with Aaron Burr, Maria Reynolds would certainly play a large part in the proceedings for that event. And so in order to keep your interest focused on this particular person, I would use what I call a proxy photograph, and I do it for this as well. After I put the talk together, I started thinking about Sir Thomas More and the screenplay, the wonderful screenplay by Robert Bolt. And in this segment of the screenplay, he has a dialogue with his son-in-law, William Roper, about the utility of law. This was the time of Henry VIII's Act of Supremacy, and More did not want to betray his own beliefs. At the same time, he didn't want to offer himself up for unnecessary sacrifice. And so More, being a pragmatist, contended that since we're unable to know the nature of the cosmos, earthly society is framed by laws, and they offer really the only shelter against the uncertainties of the universe. And so in this dialogue, William Roper says, "So now you give the devil the benefit of the law." And More says, "Yes. What would you do? Cut a great road through the law to get after the devil?" And Roper responds by saying, "Yes, I'd cut down every law in England to do just that." And More comes back and says, "And when the last law was down and the devil turned around on you, where would you hide, Roper? The laws all being flat. Do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would blow then? Yes, I would give the devil his due because I fear the devil." So this is the marker that got me interested in the topic of Robert Bell's Yellow Man Vincent. And it's present at the intersection of East Northside Drive and Old Vicksburg Road. Now, this is obviously an aerial view. You can see Roy Burkett's football field here. And you can see the old Clinton Junior High School, which used to be the high school where I graduated. And that marker is right here at the intersection. And those of you from Clinton will probably have passed by this numerous times. Anyway, it honors Robert Hall Bell, who was born in Virginia, and he established a trading post along the Natchez Trace in the 1820s. He was a prominent man in the community, had been appointed county judge by Walter Leake, and then he married Susan Morning Kane in 1827. He had tuberculosis, and it was a long, lingering illness for him, and he died on the 22nd of February, 1835. Now, Susan Morning Kane Bell was kind of a character in her own right. She was also from Virginia, and she was bridesmaid of Sarah Childers Polk in her wedding to James Knox Polk. She owned Myrtle Grove after the death of Robert Bell. She challenged his will in court because she didn't think he'd been left sufficient property in order to conform to her expectations in the way of life. In 1863, she had the Battle of Myrtle Grove, her home, against Union General Frederick Steele. Through various Masonic hand signals and some common relatives in Indiana, she successfully talked him out of burning her house down. This is her grave marker in the Clinton Cemetery. You don't often find grave markers with the future tense in them, but as you can see, she said, "If I live to be January 1st, 1857, I'll be 70 years old." Well, she did, obviously, at least until the time of the Civil War. I want to focus on Robert Bell and Susan Morning Kane Bell's great-grandson, Thomas Stewart Harmon. Mr. Harmon was a very distinguished man, born in Paulding, Mississippi, 1895. And as you can see, he cast a fairly long shadow. He was a graduate of Millsaps, had a distinguished career in the Army in World War I, Harvard Law. He owned, published, and edited the Hattiesburg American for a number of years. And then later in life, he was involved in various philanthropic and humanitarian causes. The Bell property remained in the family until the late 1950s, and there was a 30-acre tract right there at the intersection of East North Side and Old Vicksburg Road that remained. And when they sold that property, Mr. Harmon used that money to endow a scholarship at Millsaps. And this is the will of Robert Hall Bell, particularly the language that creates this scholarship. says, I hereby emancipate and set free from the bonds of slavery my yellow man Vincent for an account of his faithfulness to me during my life. And also give him 100 in cash to bear his expenses to a free state. So I thought it was very impressive. Mr. Harmon also created several books of genealogy regarding his family. And he says in the dedication of this book, he said, I had the power to interview persons long dead. I'm frank to admit that this yellow man Vincent would be high on the list. Perhaps the story you could tell would be one of the most absorbing in its human interest, its pathos, and its drama. And he sure got that right. Now, the other principal actor in this presentation is the man for whom I have a great deal of interest. He was not the most prominent and not the most powerful and not the most famous man of the 19th century, but he was certainly the most interesting, Henry Stewart Foote, who was a resident of Clinton from 1835 to 1836. These are some of his accomplishments and non-accomplishments. Native of Virginia, he was U.S. Senator from Mississippi from 1847 to 52. He was our 19th governor. He was a strong Union man, but when the South seceded from the Union, he became a member of the Confederate Congress. And he headed a peace delegation to the North to try to work out the differences in this early part of 1865. The only problem was he was the only member of the peace delegation, and nobody from the Confederacy or the Union knew about it. So when he crossed over to Union lines, they said, you got two choices, leave the country or go back to the Confederacy. He said, well, I think I'll leave the country. Anyway, he fought 4 duels. He was an implacable enemy of Jefferson Davis. He had a fist fight at the Willard Hotel with Jefferson Davis. He also had a fist fight on the Senate floor with Senator Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania. He pulled a gun on Thomas Hart Benton one time in the chambers of the Senate. He joined the Republican Party after 1875, and he was an advocate of civil rights. And he was an author and memoirist. He wrote this extensive series of memoir chapters having to do with various topics, and I got a hold of this book some years ago. It was from this book that I was able to determine the fate of Vincent Bell. Okay, Mr. Peabody, let's set the way back clock to 1835. Jackson was president, and this fellow here on the right is our Governor Hiram Runnels. This was the map of 1835, and as you can see, we are, in this part of the country, referred to as the Southwest. The counties in 1835 were being whittled out of the various Native American treaties, the Treaty of Doak Stand, of Dancing Rabbit Creek, and then finally the Pontotoc Creek Agreement with the Chickasaws. So after about 1831, following the Indian Removal Act, thousands of settlers began to flood into Mississippi to purchase cheap land at $1.25 an acre and to set up large farming operations, primarily for the planting of cotton. The economy, as well as the social structure, was on the back of slavery, as we know. Now, today's discussion will involve these communities, primarily Beatty's Bluff, Livingston, Fleetwood, and Vicksburg. Now, Fleetwood is up in the area where my father's family is from, just a few miles northwest of Fleetwood. So I know that area pretty well. Also, Clinton, Mississippi, my hometown, obviously. Within memory to these new settlers in 1835 Mississippi was the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831 in Southampton County, Virginia. 51 whites and approximately 120 enslaved people lost their lives in that rebellion. And when you travel to a frontier land and you're outnumbered 50 to 1 by your slave population, it sort of makes you have trouble sleeping some nights. Well, the devil came to Mississippi in 1835 in the person of the first American bogeyman, John Morrell, who lived from 1806 to 1844. But the bogeyman was not invented until 1835. Morrell was born in Virginia, but his family moved to Middle Tennessee when he was less than a year old. And he was, as an adolescent, fairly wild character. He was charged with breaking and entering, stealing horses, counterfeiting, and ultimately slave stealing. So he was a wild character of the Middle Tennessee area, but it's unlikely that his influence extended anywhere else. In 1834, a man by the name of Virgil Stewart had a friend who lived in Middle Tennessee by the name of John Henning. And Henning had 3 of his slaves stolen, and he suspected Morrell was behind it. Slave stealing was an operation of where you go in and convince a slave to run away from the master, and then after the master offers a reward, you go collect a reward, bring the slave back, steal him again, take it to another person, sell the slave. Slave runs away, reward is offered, reward is paid, slave runs away again, you share the money with the slave, and then you promise the slave that you'll be taking him to a free state. Whereas often as not, slave stealers would ultimately take the slaves to a swamp somewhere and dispose of them. So this brochure or pamphlet appeared in the spring of 1835 after Virgil Stewart had succeeded in luring John Morrell into capture. However, when Morrell was tried, Morrell's defense attorney castigated Virgil Stewart and accused him essentially of being a part of Morrell's operation. And he insulted the man, and Stewart took it personally, so he felt like he had to write a pamphlet to defend himself, which he did. And it got wide distribution throughout the South. It was well illustrated, and Morrell essentially became famous for his pursuit and capture of John Morrell. One of his favorite tricks was to appear as a clergyman, and while he was giving a sermon, his associates would go out and steal the congregation's horses and their valuables off of it. Actually escaped from jail after he'd been turned in by Virgil Stewart, stayed on the lam for a couple of 3 months before he was captured again. Ultimately, in 1834, Morrell was convicted of slave stealing, and he was sentenced to 10 years in jail in the Nashville prison. This is some of the language that you can find in the Great Western Land Pirate. It has the arched prose of a 19th century writer. Morrell was capable of villainous feats. He reveled in the splendor of his hard crimes. He bragged about the swamp animals eating the corpses of slaves. And worst of all, he swore profusely. Whereas Virgil Stewart, remember, this is a pseudonym. It was written under a pseudonym by the name of Augustus Quarles. It was actually Stewart. Stewart referred to Virgil Stewart as a person of untiring perseverance. He was respected and esteemed in every country he lived in by its best citizens. He was devoted in his friendships, generous in his sentiments, and true to his country. Some of that is not true. Anyway, if you distill the great Morrell land pirate conspiracy, it boils down to this. There was a mystic clan of the Confederacy. It had a grand council of captains. Thousands of clan members called strikers were in the Old Southwest. The goal was slave insurrection resulting in chaos, and the date was December 25th, 1835. The object was robbery and plunder by the mystic clan as the slaves revolted so they could establish a separate clan territory with the capital at New Orleans. Sounds fanciful, and it was. Anyway, John Morrell appeared in fiction after this, and even down up into the present day. Mark Twain, Eudora Welty, Borgia, several novels, a movie. Humphrey Bogart once played John Morrell. And Mark Twain said, Jesse James was a retail rascal, but Morrell was wholesale. And then finally, after all this blew over, one of Mississippi's earliest historians said that Virgil Stewart is now known to have been an imposter. The whole story was a fabrication. Morrell was simply a thief and a counterfeiter. And the whole plot and its tragical consequences may now be regarded as one of the most extraordinary and lamentable hallucinations of our times. In June 1835, a tragedy began to unfold. If you wonder where Beatty's Bluff is, all you have to do is find the Nissan water treatment plant, and it's right up the Big Black River, not far away from it. A woman by the name of Keziah Latham overheard some of her house slaves talking about the possibility of rebellion. She tried to eavesdrop and overhear the conversation as best she could, but couldn't make out much of the details. She told her son about it, and he talked to the house slaves, and they implicated a man from another plantation, another slave man from another plantation, in knowing about this plot. The son, Lorenzo Latham, went to the county seat of Livingston, Mississippi, and sort of asked for advice from among the persons living there on what to do. And this is Livingston. Now it's a new town with an old soul. Here's some of the buildings. Here's a map. And you can see where the town square was, I believe. It's marked out right here. And in the town square, there was a two-story brick building, which was a courthouse and a jail. And so a lot of the action is proceeding from this courthouse area. This is modern pictures of Livingston. So on the 27th of June, 1835, a committee met at Livingston, 160 members of the planter class, and they called themselves the Committee of Safety. And you can find a record of the meetings as well as the minutes that have been published. This is from 1836. And the proceedings were outlined, and they gave themselves a charter. 160 respected citizens. They were organized under the law of self-preservation, or in Latin, salus populi est suprema lex. The safety of the population is the supreme law. Wicked white men were encouraging and instigating Negroes, as per the Virgil Stewart pamphlet, and there being at least 50 Negroes to one white man in Madison County. If the usual law found them not guilty, should they go unpunished? And under the usual forms of law, much of the testimony would be excluded. In fact, all of the testimony would be excluded because in Mississippi law at the time, no white man could be convicted or testimony from a slave allowed in court as evidence. So they decided that they would offer the accused something like a trial, but if not formal, at least substantial, and substantial it was, because that's the perfect formula for a kangaroo court. Now, never show a slide like this at a meeting. But I just want to point it out to you. For people doing genealogy, it's a gold mine. The people underlined in white, I recognize as being from Hinds County. The guy underlined in red is the brother of a witness on my second great-grandfather's will. This chap down here, Mr. Osmond Claiborne, had the distinct honor of receiving a bullet from Henry Stewart Foote in his last duel. But I point out Hiram Perkins in yellow up there in gold. When this was written, Hiram Perkins had 10 days to live. After the large meeting, they established what was called a Committee of 13 to meet daily with the power to hang or to whip. 9 members of the committee constitute a quorum, and of course they wanted to protect themselves in case things went sideways or off the rails. This is a chart of the committee members giving the names. It was chaired by Dr. Marmaduke Mitchell. You can see their land holdings as well as the number of slaves. I call your attention to Mr. Thomas Hudnold. His name is also spelled Hudnall, as well as Hardin Runnels, who is the brother of the governor, and Mr. Jesse Mabry, who was a recent plantation, who had recently arrived in Madison County as a plantation owner. He had 1,700 acres, the second largest number of acres, but he had the most number of slaves at 127. This is where the action was. There were other committees of public safety as well, but none of them kept minutes, and they're not available. Beatty's Bluff, Clinton, Fleetwood, and Vicksburg. Now, Mr. Jesse Mabry was the Grand Inquisitor, or the Torquemada of the Committee of Safety. He was from South Carolina, born around 1791. He'd been successful in the mercantile business, and he used that money to leverage the purchase of a large plantation in Madison County. He was 44 years old at the time of the insurrection. Meanwhile, on Tuesday, June the 30th, 1835, the Livingston Committee interrogated a man by the name of William Saunders, who was a steam doctor. Now, if you don't know what a steam doctor is, that's somebody who advocates the use of herbals and other natural remedies, as well as steam baths for cures. There was a man by the name of Samuel Thompson who published a work, and Dr. Thompson would sell you medications if you bought a franchise from him. So he was Thompson had a rather good thing going for him, and comparing Thompsonian system with the traditional medicine, it's hard to know which system would kill you first. In fact, one of the great medical reformers, Abraham Flexner, said it was not until around 1900 that the average patient consulting the average physician had a better than even chance of profiting from the encounter. Also, on that same day, a man by the name of William Johnson, who was a plantation owner, brought in one of his slaves who had some knowledge of an insurrection being planned. And that slave accused another slave by the name of Peter, who belonged to a man named Reuel Blake, who lived in Livingston. These slaves were arrested and they were jailed by the Livingston Committee for further examination and evaluation. The next day, on Wednesday, July 1st, Jesse Mabry examined, interrogated, and chastised several slaves, by the way, which means he beat them. And they included Joe, a blacksmith, Weaver, a slave preacher, and a man by the name of Russell. Weaver held out and never confessed anything. He took everything Mabry could dish out and he never opened his mouth. Joe, however, did confess under torture, and he implicated white men in the plot: Reuel Blake, Joshua Cotton, and William Saunders. Cotton and Saunders were steam doctors. And according to Joe the blacksmith, Sam, Weaver, and Russell were under the command of these white men. According to Joe, the slaves would use hoes and axes to kill their masters. They would rob storehouses. They planned to move from Beatty's Bluff to Livingston, from there to Vernon, Clinton, with the ultimate goal of Natchez, and they would make a last stand at Devil's Punch Bowl. It's amazing what you can get somebody to confess to if you use the right techniques. Reuel Blake was from Maine. In his youth, he'd been a seafarer. He'd lived in Madison County for 6 years, and he was a slave owner. He was a genwright and a carpenter. He had a reputation as a hard worker, and he was employed on and off by Thomas Hudnall, who knew him well. He was unmarried. He had no family. His work often brought him into contact with plantation slaves. He was a loner and socially inept, not suffering fools gladly, especially those who contracted his services and refused to pay him. Reuel Blake was instructed to chastise his slave Peter. And when he started using the whip on Peter, it was not done to the satisfaction of the other people who were there. And so the whip was taken away from Reuel Blake, and the beating was of such severity that Reuel Blake protested, and he attacked the man wielding the whip, so his slave Peter would not be further injured. That was a big mistake. Peter had to flee the area with the assistance of Mr. Hudnall, who gave him a horse and some money. So Reuel Blake had to leave town immediately out of fear of his life. On Thursday, July the 2nd, Jesse Mabry was back in Beatty's Bluff. He interrogated a slave named Jim, who implicated William Saunders, Joshua Cotton, Reuel Blake, and a man by the name of Elijah Moss. Also at this chastisement was a man by the name of Angus Donovan, a young white man from Kentucky, who tried to intervene as Mabry was beating the slave Jim. Another big mistake on that part of Angus Donovan. He was from Kentucky. He had brought down a load of corn to sell, and on his way back, he saw some half-sunken keel boats around Beatty's Bluff and decided to start a salvage operation. During this work, he came in contact with slaves around the area, and it was thought that he harbored abolitionist views. Also on July the 2nd, Mabry chastised a slave by the name of Bacchus, who indicated that there was a white man by the name of Sliver involved in this insurrection. Donovan was arrested and transported back to the jail in Livingston on Thursday, July 2nd. At Beatty's Bluff, in the afternoon of July 2nd, the slaves Jim, Bacchus, Russell, Sam, and Weaver were hanged. On July the 2nd in Livingston, Joshua Cotton and William Saunders were arrested, and a $500 reward was posted for the capture of Reuel Blake. Cotton was from New England. He had immigrated to Hinds County in 1830. He married in 1834, moved to Livingston. He became a steam doctor. He had few social interactions, and some claim to have been defrauded by Cotton in business dealings. His business involved peddling these remedies around plantations, so he came in contact frequently with the slaves. Saunders somehow turned on Cotton, and Saunders testified that Cotton was a cold and devious man and who had been involved in slave stealing. That evening, a crowd broke into the Livingston jail at night and hanged William Johnson's slave and Peter, Reuel Blake's slave. On July 3rd, Saunders was tried and he gave testimony against Cotton. Both Cotton and Saunders were sentenced to death. On Friday, July 3rd, in Yazoo County, near the town of Benton, an itinerant white man named Hunter was inquiring about teaching positions, and someone got the idea that he was part of the Murrell slave insurrection plot, and he was lynched and decapitated. These are white men. On July the 4th, 1835, in Livingston, they celebrated the holiday by hanging Joshua Cotton and William Saunders. Now, Cotton, before he went to the gallows, made this amazing, spiteful confession. Essentially, he admitted everything that the plotters had feared. He admitted to the authenticity of the Murrell plot. He admits being a member of the Grand Council. The object of the plot was plunder. Christmas date had to be abandoned because Murrell was in prison. He said that there were 150 Grand Council members who were in Mississippi. He said that Blake's slave Peter was involved and he'd been corrupting slaves. Andrew Boyd was the local leader, and the Earl Brothers of Vicksburg were his main lieutenants. He described stores of arms in Hinds County, particularly around Clinton. At the same time, on July 4th, 1835, Vicksburg was celebrating the 4th of July holiday, and one of the men who showed up was a man by the name of Francis Cabler. Cabler was a gambler and a notorious drunk. He began to disrupt the proceedings. He wouldn't be quiet. Stood on tables, started breaking dishes when he was asked to be silent so the speeches could be heard. Cabler left, and he came back with a knife, a dirk, and a pistol. He was quickly subdued by the Regiment of Mississippi Volunteers and promptly taken to the woods, tarred and feathered. By that time, the citizens of Vicksburg had their blood up for gamblers who they blamed for a lot of the decline of the morals of the city. And a notice was posted advising gamblers to leave town within 24 hours, and they meant it. On the next day, Sunday, July 5th, back in Fleetwood, Mississippi, the committee met under the chairmanship of one Patrick Sharkey. They questioned, they didn't beat or chastise, intimidate in other way, 5 or 6 slaves, and they were released unharmed. Patrick Sharkey wrote a letter to Governor Runnels requesting that civil authority be reestablished over the matter because he was unhappy with a system of kangaroo courts. Back in Vicksburg, in the early morning hours of Monday, July the 6th, the Citizen Committee on Safety raided Truman North's gambling house. They were led by Dr. Hugh Bodley, who was a young physician at the time. When Bodley attacked the house and ran through the door, he was dropped by 7 shots and was immediately killed. The citizens of Vicksburg were outraged. They dragged the inhabitants of the house out into the street, took them to makeshift gallows, and hanged them all, including one of the inhabitants who had been injured in gunfire and was practically unconscious. And the oldest monument in Vicksburg is this one here to Dr. Bodley, dates from 1835. Vicksburg got a very bad reputation after that, particularly in the newspapers of the East and the North, and it took them years to live it down. A lot of interesting things going on here. This is a feral cat being dragged across the back of a poor victim here. Here's someone beating a child. These guys are having a knife fight. You notice they're holding a rope so they can't get far from each other. Gamblers, here's a guy who's obviously drunk. Horse racing and other acts of moral turpitude. On July the 6th, the Livingston Committee found Lee Smith of Hinds County, arrested him. He was implicated by cotton. He was sentenced to 48 hours and leave the state, or he would be slicked. Meanwhile, 72-year-old John Gregory and another 56-year-old man were found guilty of participation in the insurrection, and they were slicked. This is what slicking is. Tie somebody to the ground face down, strip them naked, tie their hands and feet to posts, and then usually people take turns whipping them. So that's slicking. And Mr. Smith, although he had been released by the committee and was on his way home to pack up and leave town, he was kidnapped by the Committee of Safety from Clinton, and he was slicked with 300 lashes. These are white men. On July the 6th, Monday, July the 6th, Hiram Perkins and his posse had gone to Hinds County and arrested the Ransom brothers as being involved in this Morrell conspiracy. They encountered Patrick Sharkey in the Fleetwood Committee. Mr. Sharkey was determined not to let the Livingston Committee have any prisoners from Hinds County. So the Fleetwood Committee, with Patrick Sharkey in the lead, drove off the Livingston Committee, and the Livingston Committee under Mr. Perkins was not happy at all. In fact, they spent the night in the woods plotting what they could do to bring Patrick Sharkey in. The next morning, they rode back to Livingston to provision up, and then on the afternoon of the 7th, they rode back toward Fleetwood to ambush Patrick Sharkey in his house that night. Now, Patrick Sharkey was a veteran of the War of 1812. He was 46 years old at the time of the incident. Sharkey had been tipped off to the possible attack by the men from Livingston. He placed piles of wood around his house for bonfires. That night, he retreated to an outbuilding. There was no light coming from his house, so he could see what was happening outside his residence. And Mr. Perkins led the charge on the Sharkey house, and for his troubles, he was killed from a shot through the heart by Patrick Sharkey. Sharkey managed to wound a man named Stanford Hodge. He grazed Hiram Reynolds in the neck, killed 2 horses, and by then the Livingston Committee decided that they had had enough. So, we started out with the committee interested in rebellious slaves, and now we're up to the point where plantation slave owners are under suspicion. Patrick Sharkey owned 26 slaves. On Tuesday, July the 7th, Angus Donovan was tried, found guilty, sentenced to hang. He had requested that Henry Stewart Foote come to his aid as a defense attorney. Foote came to the Livingston courthouse and was terrified of the atmosphere. He felt extreme danger. And remember, Foote was a guy who would just rather fight than look at you, and was a veteran of dueling. So he's not a man who was easy to frighten, and Foote was. On Wednesday, July the 8th, Patrick Sharkey thought it prudent to surrender himself to the Clinton Safety Committee for his own protection. And he had a couple of aces in the hole. His first cousin was Judge William Lewis Sharkey, who was the Chief Justice of the Mississippi Supreme Court, and he had Henry Stewart Foote on his side. So Patrick Sharkey ended up going free to the great displeasure of the committee from Livingston. On Wednesday, July the 8th, in Vicksburg, Rural Blake was captured by the Livingston Committee. By this time, Henry Foote thought that there was too much of a resemblance of things going on in Madison County to the French Revolution in their committees of public safety. On July the 9th, Rural Blake arrived back in Livingston. He was tried and sentenced to be hanged. He requested to be given overnight to write his will and get his affairs in order, which was granted. And this is an amazing document here. This is Rural Blake's will that he wrote himself within hours of when he was executed. Interestingly, he left everything to Thomas Hudnall. He had no family, no children. So he left everything to Hudnall, presumably so his slaves would be cared for and his other debts and assets sufficiently distributed according to his wishes. Rural Blake was hanged on Friday, July the 10th, and in his last words, he attested that he was about to meet God, possessed of many sins and imperfections. But he said he would not be afraid to die if he was as innocent of all the other sins as he was of the charges that he was about to answer to. Before the executioner reached for the handle to release the trap, he asserted his innocence once again. When the trap door failed to open, Rural Blake stepped forward and jumped from the platform, essentially committing suicide. On Wednesday, July 15th, the Earl Brothers who had been implicated by Joshua Cotton were arrested in Warren County. They were brought to Livingston for questioning. William Earl was tortured so badly that he committed suicide in his jail cell that night. On July 20th, his brother John was tried and convicted of abetting slave insurrection and remanded back to Warren County for publishment. He was ultimately freed. And on July 20th, the Livingston Committee disbanded. Now we need to back up about a couple of weeks to the 8th of July. Robert Bell's yellow man Vincent was tried before the Clinton Safety Committee because Bell had been discovered in possession of what the committee considered to be excess gunpowder. So he was brought before the committee. And in the words of Henry Stewart Foote, when I rode into the town of Clinton, I saw a large multitude assembled on one of the most popular streets. He dismounts. He soon learned that the Vigilance Committee, composed of some of the best men of the county, had been trying a mulatto man whom I knew very well on being a participant in the scheme of insurrection. The committee had tried him and sentenced him to be whipped only. And they would indeed have discharged him altogether as I learned from themselves, had they not dreaded the indignant rage of the population of the town, then in a very excited manner. The young man had been the ownership of a venerable gentleman of the neighborhood, Captain Bell, a Virginia friend. He was a man of great respectability and intelligence. Vincent had been a great favorite of his master, and who had left him free. Vincent was nearly white and singularly civil and polite in his manners, since his master deceased, a faithful protector of his family, which consisted of his widow and a single female child. And then Susan Mourning Kane made an appeal herself in tears to the committee not to hang Vincent. And then Foote describes how he confronted a mob, tried to rescue Vincent at the end, but he was unsuccessful. Harkening back to Francis Stewart Harmon's curiosity about what the yellow man Vincent, what stories he could tell, and whether it would be absorbing in human interest and pathos. On Tuesday, July the 9th, 1835, Vincent was hanged by the citizens of Clinton. And when he was taken to the black oak tree, he was told that if he gave the names of other conspirators, he might be set free. Vincent responded, "Death is certain for me. It benefits me nothing to bring others to the same state." Postscript. Virgil Stewart also published a pamphlet on the conditions of the 1835 slave rebellion in Mississippi. Came out in 1836. After that, Stewart essentially disappears from the pages of history. Some think he went to Texas, and his place and date of birth and his grave are unknown. John Morrell was released from prison in Nashville in 1846. He died some months later of tuberculosis. After he was buried in the New Smyrna Cemetery in Bedloe County, his grave was disturbed and his skull and other body parts removed. His skull disappeared. It appeared at carnivals around the South for a while at 10 cents a peep. And then in 1848, his thumb supposedly came into possession of the Nashville Medical College. It was subsequently turned over to the Tennessee Department of Archives and History, where it's brought out once a year in its little coffin to be displayed. Questions?
If anyone has a question, raise your hand, we'll bring the mic to you.
Okay, thank you. Not a question, but a comment. As I listen to all of this and your presentation, I have to say that I'm shocked and appalled at man's inhumanity toward fellow men. And yet, as I listen to all of this, and this is not something that I ever read about or learned about in school, it just lets me know that man has not changed very much. Some of the same games that were played then are being played out today. And I think it's something that we really need to know so that we can stop playing those kind of games.
The only thing new is the history you don't know.
Which is why we need to know it.
Right.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Do we know if Vincent was the son of Bell?
We do not. Okay. If I had to bet, I would say yes, but that would be only a bet.
Okay. Do you know if Vincent had a wife or children?
No, he did not. As far as I can tell, he did not.
Do we know where he's buried?
We don't know that either. I would bet it's probably somewhere near the intersection now of Old Vicksburg Road and East Northside Drive, where the old home place was.
Could you talk a little bit about the creation of the historical marker?
I beg your pardon?
The creation of the historical marker.
Yes, the creation of the historical marker was the idea of Francis Stewart Harmon. He was very proud of his ancestor for freeing his servant and offering him money to migrate to a free state. And Mr. Harmon thought that a scholarship memorializing both Robert Bell and his yellow man Vincent would be an appropriate way to do that.
And is that scholarship still active?
It is. The money from the trust has been rolled over into the General Scholarship Fund at Millsaps.
We have a couple of questions from the live stream. One asks, where is the Stewart pamphlet about the slave rebellion held in archives? Where can that be found?
It should be available in the restricted access materials
At the Mississippi
at the
Department of
Mississippi
Archives.
Department of Archives.
And then Bill Osborne asks, where was that home place?
It was at the intersection of Old Vicksburg Road and East Northside Drive, which would be the southeast corner.
One quick question, Dr. Harmon was the...
Hold on, let me get you the mic so everybody can. No.
Sorry about that. Dr. Harmon was the president, Dr. Harmon was the president, I believe, of Millsaps College. Is there any relationship? Or
No, he was not president of Millsaps.
Is that correct? Okay, so
He was
there's-
just a graduate of Millsaps.
Okay.
Other questions? Yep, two more, one here.
It's always interesting to look at all the names and names that we know in present day Mississippi, wondering if they're related. I noticed the last name Ott on one of the slides. Is that an ancestor of Paul Ott? Was that
I
the
don't know
same-
that. That name appears as a witness on the will of Rural Blake. So if there was an Ott descendant somewhere who wanted to go back and try to find a link, I think it would be fairly easy to do. So I don't know the answer to the question, but it'd be a good start for taking a journey down memory lane.
This is not something about which I knew anything until I began studying in anticipation of this. But I was a history major at the University of Wisconsin, and we were required to take a historiography course using available microfilm archives. And one of them were the archives of the witch trials in Salem 150 years earlier. And I am struck, maybe the technology gets this compressed into a few weeks rather than the months it took in Salem, but the intensity of the accusations, the hysteria with which these safety committees acted strikes me as so similar. Do you see these anything like this here? I mean, this is an intensity.
Absolutely. I
Of
mean,
hysteria.
it's repeated, it was repeated in the French Revolution when the initial revolutionaries began slaughtering each other during the Reign of Terror. In other words, like Saturn eating his children. And this was a similar phenomena here. It started out as a search for rebellious slaves, and it ended up the plantation aristocracy accusing one another of being part of the Murrell conspiracy. Conspiracy theories are our oldest, most persisting, fundamental, and enduring national pastime, without doubt.
Was, in your research, have you found any other counties with, and I guess this is a question to the reaction of Nat Turner is what drove all of this? Or was the narrative for this? Because it was what, 5 years difference? And have you found any of these potential pamphlets or rumors of other counties?
I think the Nat Turner rebellion did play a part in the psychology of the plantation owners during this era. There's no question about it. That was within memory. Everyone knew about Nat Turner. But I think the driving force specifically behind this aberration was the Virgil Stewart pamphlet and the Great Land Pirate, because that took that psychological disquiet and focused it on the possibility of danger near at hand.
We have a couple more questions from the live stream. Bill Osborne, who asked the question about the Bell home place, has the same question about the Foote home place, where the Foote home place was.
I looked in the records of where Foote probably lived in Clinton, and the lot was just to the west of Monroe Street, where it crosses the railroad in Clinton. That was where Foote's home and law office, according to the plat maps of the time of 1835-36. So it was right there immediately to your left as you're headed north on Monroe and crossing the railroad track.
And then a question from another. What is the source of Vincent's last words?
I got that from the Rothman book. He references the source for that in the Rothman book.
Hi, I'm Martha Hudson from Clinton. We are undergoing a process in Clinton to recognize victims of lynching in our town, and we have several names, and we're working with the Institute in North Alabama, Equal Justice, to get that done. My question is, you referenced the Black Oak, and I understand that was where some of these murders took place.
Right.
Could you tell us anything more about that? Because we're looking to locate that if possible. Thank you.
I've heard anecdotal stories, and there's no proof of this whatever, but one source told me that the Black Oak was down there where the site of the Clinton riot was. So it's on Vernon Road, the intersection of Vernon Road and the railroad track. So as you're headed north, it would be to your left. Supposedly that was the site of the Black Oak.
Should answer her question. Yeah, there's a lot of material about Negro slave revolts. Herbert Athacker did about in the 40s, about 100 or more. In Natchez, it was tumult and silence. About Second Creek in Natchez, kind of similar. I'm trying to remember the answer right now. White or black. Winthrop Jordan, Winthrop Jordan, who was teaching at Ole Miss, lost a whole lot of it. I mean, not a lot of it. Make you puke.
Yes, Herbert Etker was one of the original documenters of slave rebellions, and he documented quite a number.
And remind me, what was the closest thing to an official count of the murders associated with the 1835 slave insurrection?
All in all, if you count the hangings, the death of Hiram Perkins, the suicide of William Earl, etc., turns out to be 14 documented white men. The documented deaths of slaves, I believe, run to 12, but there were other reports of slaves being lynched elsewhere during the same period of time, and that number ranges from 12 up to 20.
Thank you all for coming here today. Remember our 2 programs tomorrow, the free weekend coming up, and then join us for next week's History's Lunch on the new graphic novel about James Meredith's integration of the University of Mississippi. Today, help me thank Douglas Richardson for this fabulous program.